I'll start by introducing the topic and myself. So my name is Brian Cugelman, and I'm a specialist in using behavioral science for web design and marketing, and I'm also a researcher at the same time. And for the next hour, we're going to talk about emotional design strategies for higher conversions. And I was speaking with Susie earlier on and saying that actually this topic is a little bit of a tough sell in the market. And primarily it's because you have to learn a little bit of biology. And I know it sounds like a tough thing to say, that you're going to have to learn a little bit of biology to be a good user experience professional, digital marketer, and conversion specialist. But I think in the next hour, you'll quickly understand why this is. And you'll also see that it's actually not too much work as well. So just a little bit of biology. So let's get going. Let's start off with a quote from the CEO of Saatchi & Saatchi, who said that reason leads to conclusions, emotion leads to action. And I think he just nailed it with that one. And a lot of us who have been working in any form of social change or behavior change or conversion, whether it's trying to get sales or having marketing success, have probably tried a lot of times to give good rational arguments, to assume that everyone acts in their best interest, that people do cost-benefit analysis before they make a decision. And then we find out that actually, no, people do things because it makes them feel proud. They do things to avoid embarrassment sometimes. Sometimes you have no clue why someone has done something, but you know it's definitely not reason. And so we know that emotions are very powerful in the decision-making process and ultimately in shaping what people do. So before we get into it, I'm going to introduce myself to you properly now. And I'd also like to introduce you to Leo, who is a collaborator on this. So my name is Brian Cugelman, and I did a PhD in using behavioral science online. And I've also worked for many years in social change and behavior change and nonprofit organizations, spent many years with the United Nations. I also worked with a number of companies and private sector, and actually the commercial behavior change is easiest because it's easy to measure financial transactions. The other areas are a lot more challenging. And I've been teaching people how to use digital psychology for a number of years, but I had a problem in that I never explained motivation. Because when you use behavioral science, you don't need to know what motivates people. You just need to know what works. And we do that by looking up randomized control trials and different scientific studies that have tested all sorts of different psychological strategies and behavior change techniques. And we look them up in scientific papers that are based on a lot of practice, not just abstract ivory tower concepts and theories, but the good research comes from real world applications. And when we look at it en masse, we can get a sense of what works. But I never answered the question of what actually motivates people, because in the behavioral sciences, you don't need to know. We just need to know what works. So I started doing work about 3 years ago on the neuroscience of emotion and motivation. And thanks to my collaboration with Dr. Restivo there on the right, we were able to unearth a huge amount of some of the latest cutting edge science on personality, emotional systems, and behavior from a neuroscientific point of view. So what we're going to go through is a collaboration between myself as a behavioral scientist focused more on psychology, and Leo, who's a behavioral neuroscientist. Someone said that they can't hear any audio. Is it possible to make a comment into the chat box if you can hear me? Okay, so we've received feedback that many people can hear, so that's good. So I'm just going to send in a chat message on this. Thanks a lot. So. Okay, so just a message to anyone who couldn't hear. Okay, sent that in the chat box, so it can work, and there will be a recording. So let's continue. So what I want to do first is contrast taking our psychological and behavioral science approach to behavior change in websites and apps and any technology where we're trying to get conversions, and more a neurological or emotional perspective. So here on the left, we have psychological strategies. So we might use strategies like, say, loss aversion and social norms or social pressure. And we literally apply these principles. We say, okay, how can we creatively apply a social norm on this landing page to get more people to opt in? Like maybe saying, hey, 1,400 people have already signed up, so what about you? Now, an emotional approach is a little bit different. So in that sense, we're going to start from a different point, not with the psychological or behavior change technique, but with the emotional outcome. So we'll say, you know what, we're going to use an incentive. So we want someone to feel that one of their core needs is going to be met on here, but we also want to use a pressure tactic so that they also at the same time feel that they're going to lose something, or going to be at some sort of loss for something that's important to them. And we might say, well, how can we implement some design strategies based on these more basic concepts? And when we go into the nuance of the emotion, we might say, well, what we're going to do with the loss is maybe play on a social loss. So maybe having someone feel like they might get rejected from the group if they don't conform, or another core emotion might be playing with their status emotion, so feeling a loss of importance in society. So these are completely different approaches, and they work very well together, because when you understand more of the behavioral science principles and the psychology, helps you better to implement those emotional strategies. So let's start by taking a neurological look at the brain. So actually what I have here is not a neurological look at how emotions work. This is what you're going to hear most of the time, and a lot more of like what I would call pop psychology. So yes, you will hear the forebrain is where most of the cognitive functions happen. Midbrain is where emotions, hindbrain are basic survival. And there's some ballpark truth to this, but if you actually go speak to a neuroscientist, you'll quickly find out that they don't actually segment the brain along these categories. These are actually pretty close to concepts that Aristotle spoke about 2,000 years ago. So these are not the most useful or the most accurate. They are core areas we target, but it's a little misleading because they just don't neatly pack up as conveniently as they're described. So what I'm going to introduce to you is a model that me and Leo developed based on the core processes involved in the brain in behavior change. Now, we don't have a nice picture of a brain, so it doesn't look as scientific. And so this is a little bit more about what a textbook would look like. So I'm going to try and go quickly through this so that we could get to some of the examples, because you have to see the implementation to really start to understand the concepts. So to start off, on the left, we have a trigger event. So this is going to be something external in your interactive design. The content you put on a page will impact people. Now, it's going to go through their senses. So most of us are working visually. So that means people will see things with their eyes. If you're working with video, people will also hear sounds. So go through 2 senses rather than 1. And then what happens is the brain instantly interprets these signals through schemas. So schemas are the network structures that the brain uses to remember and encode information, certain structures. And depending on our past experiences, certain symbols and words and concepts are going to trigger different types of emotional reactions that come next. So if we've learned something is good, it'll be a more positive emotion, and if something's a threat, can trigger a negative emotion. And then there are a number of very specific emotional reactions. So the emotions can trigger habitual behaviors based on learned associations. Now, there's a point where this starts reaching our conscious awareness, where someone can do something called cognitive appraisal, where we catch an emotion taking hold and we become aware what we're perceiving. And at that point, we can try and shape the direction of the emotion, can try and take control. But normally it's very hard to control our emotions. So controlling emotions is it's something you don't do on the fly. When an emotion triggers, you feel it and your body reacts. There's not a huge amount you can do. You have to more try and manage and take control of your system, which is already acting independent of your willed conscious awareness. Now, normally the way we control things is by reframing and reshaping how we look at situations. So that's called cognitive appraisal. And after we have deliberate behavior and sometimes more impulsive behavior. Now, during the process, decision-making is a gradual process shaped throughout. There's not a lot of evidence for the argument that people are bombarded with information and they make rational decisions. More the conscious mind comes after the emotional systems. We're not going to talk about today, but glucose consumption is a key factor in interactive design, because the more conscious effort required, the more you will drain a person's limited supply of energy. So let's go take a quick look at this and get into the emotional part of the model. So for starters, there's a trigger event, and it'll go through multiple senses, not 5, but actually, I believe we might have about 20 senses. There's a bit of a debate on it. So something happens externally on your website, and then it impacts onto the brain. It gets interpreted. Now, can anyone tell me, how do you feel when you read this? And you could type into the message box. So we have a range of emotions. I like the first one, which was suspicious. And that's normally how I would respond. A lot of people said amazing. A bit cheesy, happy. You're right, makes me smile. So some of us will actually respond to slide deck that flatters us, that says that we're good. And now technically we shouldn't do this, because this is a PowerPoint presentation on a computer. It's not a legitimate compliment, but yet many of us feel this way. Some of us are suspicious. You're like, okay, this Brian guy is trying to play something on me. What's he up to? Which is also a very legitimate response. What I found in a lot of emotional testing is that when people don't fully have trust, they might have this more sort of distrustful, standoffish type of reaction. Most people do react quite positively off the bat. And this is a little bit irrational because, after all, these are words on a PowerPoint presentation, not to us. So how does this happen? So one of the arguments for this phenomena is that we have learned schemas. So these are examples of how neural schemas correlate to hierarchical word dictionaries. That's just the point. This is that there's some good evidence now that the way the brain actually encodes memories and relationships is similar to hierarchies. And the citation for this work is in the bottom left. And the argument is that when we read something that's positive, that has been positive for us our whole life, the schemas interpret it and it triggers the emotion because we have these past categories that we've learned. At the same time, this helps us with UX, and UX is key for conversion because people are not going to convert if they can't follow processes and steps. And so we often want to build our websites and our interactive technology on the categories that people already understand because it makes it easier for them to continue. And so I'm a huge fan of Twitter Bootstrap. I actually, last November, I started going back to coding and building from scratch. I build everything off of Bootstrap. And one of the wonderful things about Bootstrap is it has a lot of great conventions that build on these existing schemas. So people understand folder systems, like here on the bottom left, and traffic sides, and then we bring that into our design patterns, and it just makes people learn faster because they already have a pre-existing schema. So schemas trigger emotion. So what is an emotion? Now, a lot of the philosophies on what emotional design is, they're going to focus a lot more on positive design. So things that make us feel good, but we have to look at the whole constellation of emotions to master emotional design. So let me describe what an emotion is. An emotion is what happens when the mind prepares the body to deal with a threat or an opportunity. And so what happens is when the brain classifies a situation, it then gets the body ready before we're even consciously aware. And that's why emotions can trigger feelings like anger, fear, disgust, but also happiness and surprise, and a huge amount of positive emotions. And our facial expressions change, our body reactions change, and we go through a whole physiological shift. So now, when it comes to focusing on core motivating emotions, one of my favorite places to start is with research on what are the core motivators of people. And there are different models out there. And I'm going to give you one of my favorite. I'm going to walk quickly through it. And we're just going at a pretty high level today. So we're going to go fast. But this comes from research that updated Maslow's hierarchy of needs by looking at it from an evolutionary psychology perspective. And here at the bottom, we have physiological needs. So that's when a person feels the need to survive. Now, one of the core motivators is not as much the need to, get more than what we physically need, but we feel this more alarming in terms of loss. So whenever there's a threat, this will wake us up. Now, over here on the right, we have those positive emotions tied to these core motivators, and on the left, the negative ones. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how we can take these basic models and turn it into motivational models by looking at the upper left and right. Where on the top we have incentives, so that's where you give something to someone, and then that's a motivating situation. And on the left, if you take away something bad, that's positive. So when we talk about motivation, I'm going to go up this pyramid and show you how we tie this in with loss aversion tactics. So again, at the bottom, physiological needs. So if we can promise someone, we'll give them like the food that they need to deal with their hunger, or the drink to deal with their thirst. That is a motivating thing. When we tell them that they can avoid not being satisfied, then that's also a motivator through loss aversion. Now, self-protection is another core survival need, and that's where we're motivated to feel safe and secure. But normally at that point, we're not really driven to go any further. So a lot of the motivation there is in avoiding threats, like physical and other social security threats that impact our self-protection. Next up, we have social affiliation. We're driven by the need to connect with other people, and it's very easy to motivate people to connect with others, to have better relationships, to have meaningful relationships. And whenever there's a threat to a relationship, you trigger emotions like jealousy, where relationships are threatened, and feelings of being banished or kicked out and ostracized from groups. Very demotivating. Next up, status and esteem. People are heavily driven to feel important and special, to have a special role in society. And when that is threatened, that's the point where people can feel very low and depressive types of states. The opposite of status, so low status, feeling degraded, unimportant, are really tied to depressive states. So these are very bad emotions. I generally treat anything in this area with a little bit of caution, because you can really backfire and trigger some of the wrong emotions if you don't have emotional intelligence and sensitivity at this level. Now, this is building on work from Maslow, but tying it in with internal motivators. So what the researchers did is they threw off self-actualization, said it was a form of status achievement, and they looked at what the next are the reproductive emotions. So, some of the old motivational models do not have sex, so clearly they are completely off base. I would say it's a pretty core motivator of humans. So next is the desire for sex, so mating. Then next we have love, pair bonding, and parenting. So these are all very powerful motivators. And we're going to look at them in terms of incentives, so what drives people, and loss aversion, what moves us away. Now, underneath all these, me and my colleagues, we mapped out a number of neurotransmitters that help us understand the constellation of emotions and which ones are tied together. We're not going to get into the detail. I'll talk about them a little bit. But you have to understand the story of each of these to really get to grips with how emotions work and what drives behavior. So let's just start with the two biggies. So dopamine and cortisol. So dopamine is triggered on anticipation of reward. It gives people energy. We want to trigger it. And when you do, it will normally get people curious and moving towards something to take a closer look. It's an energizer. The next is cortisol. So that's part of the fear response. So that's when there's a threat, and that normally raises sympathetic, it's part of the sympathetic nervous system being activated, and it's associated with avoiding threats and more hostile. We could also talk about serotonin and its role in learned associations about what doesn't work and avoiding. Also relevant, but not right now. So anyone out there order blind box subscription services? Any of you? If you are ordering these and you like them, chances are you are a dopamine junkie, because blind box subscription services, they play on a person's curiosity about what's coming next. And this is actually what we do a lot in web page and landing page design. Most value propositions and benefit statements are going to be dopamine triggers. So they're going to be like the blind box mystery. Okay, this is something I'm interested in. It's something good for me. They're teasing out that this is meeting a core need, but I got to see what's inside. And that's how a value prop really works. There's many descriptions. My description of a value prop, it's a dopamine trigger. So next, cortisol. So this is for threat avoidance. So at the end of your subscription with Norton, they're going to tell you that loss of protection is imminent and it's critical that you renew now. Tomorrow your PC will be vulnerable to viruses, spyware, botnets, and other attacks. So this is an alarming motivational tactic. So how can we put a couple of these into a bit of a clearer emotional framework? So what I've got in front is a common model called Arousal and Valence, or there's a number of frameworks, but what we did is we mapped a number of the emotions, and we found that there's a few other dimensions to this that help us understand what's going on. Now, in my teaching, this is one of the core models, and I always am very transparent that, in fact, this is the best model for teaching, but it's not the most accurate. It's the most accurate in a simple form. So I believe the best emotional models work best in 3 dimensions, but they're very hard to teach, and they're very hard for people to apply and work with. So what we're looking at is a fair approximation of how to map emotions. So at the top, we have emotional states that are high energy, and they raise our awareness, and they get us focused. And at the bottom are more passive and unfocused mood states. On the right are positive emotions, and on the left are negative emotions. Now, as we go up towards the upper right, we have emotions where people feel more control. They feel more empowered, and this is where we'll talk about excitement, anticipation of reward, feeling connected with others. As we go down towards the bottom, where people have less control, people feel disempowered. They don't have the ability to deal with their situation, and this is where we have like fairly bad emotions like feeling unimportant and degraded, and where we will talk about depressive states. Now, as we go up towards the upper left, we talk about the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight. And this is where we have stressful reactions to situations where people are alarmed. Now, stress is not a bad thing. We need it to get up in the morning, and it motivates people to get things done. So this is where in the upper left, we talk about pressure tactics. Now, as we go down to the bottom right, rest and digest, that's where people feel comfortable and safe and secure. And this is where we'll talk about more loyalty emotions. So now let me talk about what's underneath the hood and how we start turning these emotions into very specific interactive design strategies that we can apply right after this webinar. So again, in the upper left, I talked about those positive emotions, and we're looking at this from a bit of a behaviorist perspective. So my notation for the motivators up here is that when you're trying to get someone into that upper, oh, sorry, my bad. I said upper left. I meant this upper right-hand quadrant where we're talking about the optimistic emotions. We're promising to give somebody something good, and that's positive. That's going to be motivating. Now, the way we motivate people here on the left in stressed area, where we talk about loss aversion or pressure tactics, is where we promise someone we will take away something bad, and that's good. That's a motivator. Now, let's go down to the bottom to talk about the pessimistic emotions. This is where we literally promise to give you something bad. So we generally want to avoid this state, except for making temporary tactical diversions through pessimism to discontent people sometimes. Because we're going to actually use this quadrant to get people out of contented states when we can't upsell them. And now let's go to the bottom right-hand side where we have content emotions, where people feel that we're going to promise to take away something good, which will be bad. And now, normally when you have a loyal customer, they're actually in this content state. They're happy with the products they have. They don't want to move. They're not going to move. So if you want to get them to move, you have to have some, engineered obsolescence where people believe that it's imminent, they're going to get something bad, and then we have to move them on. So let's take a look. So I've talked a lot about the strategy. Let's start looking at some visuals. So here we have the early days where I was testing a tool in Lucky Orange. So this is like a heat map mouse tracking tool, and it gives you statistics on how you're doing. So the statistics today were, stats are looking down. And basically the emotional valence of this and all the messaging is basically helplessness. So they're telling me things are bad. It's almost like a celebration of despair. Now, it's going to be very hard to motivate people and get them to change anything, to take any action if we're just dwelling in negative emotions. So normally, if we want to get someone to move, if we have a negative message, we normally need to combine it with an efficacy message, otherwise known as what you can do about it. So alternative. So just a straight up pessimistic message will not motivate anyone. So people sometimes confuse loss aversion with negative messaging, and here's a classic example. So this is not loss aversion, this is just celebrating failure. Now, here's Avast, and they have their web plugin that's trying to get me to engage more with their tools. And they say, do you really want to put your account at risk? So they're playing on the stressed out emotions, and then they're also pushing me to the optimistic ones. So this is actually something that can motivate, because they have these two areas covered. So they're issuing a threat, and the threat is that I can get rid of this sort of bad situation to get to a good state. And they could be tuning up the optimistic message, saying, the more positive, sign up to secure your internet browsing right now. Now, look at this example. So this is a plugin for WordPress, Inbound Now, and they're just teasing out that dopamine. They're just trying to trigger with curiosity. So what's new in 1.8.2.2.1? So this is maybe not the strongest, but it's enough to trigger behavior. So anyone who's using this software might be wondering, hey, what is new? They're in. For people who don't know, this won't make any sense. And so dopamine triggers can be very simple, as just arousing that curiosity, and it's a core motivator. So these sort of teasing tactics are great ways of getting people to engage. Now, if you continually feed on these messages and you actually give people something positive, you're going to be making positive associations. So every time you tease them out, if you've actually rewarded them with something tied to your enticing message, you will get continued behavior. And if not, then you have what is known as clickbait, which is often big dopamine triggers that actually don't deliver on their promise. So Here we have flow, and just got a straightforward positive message. You could save, so this is benefit, saving some money, fairly straightforward. Not a lot, just as simple. This is a first step in sort of progressive tactics, a bit of a foot in the door. Now, what if we start combining things? So here we have pessimistic and optimistic much more overtly. So this is something you don't see a lot of. Men's spanks, sort of. So these are, for guys who want to have a six-pack, you just buy this shirt. So they show sort of the negative and the positive state at the same time, so playing on these two emotional valences. So when you have that sort of negative state with the what you can do about it, we can that in. So this is not so much a pressure tactic, which would also be then stressed and optimistic, as opposed to a little bit more, a bit of a pessimistic, optimistic. Now, let's look a little bit more in detail. So here we have the good old 1, 2, 3. So they're using positive messaging, and then they're coming up with a request. So one of the positive emotions, we didn't look in details because we're just going quick in this webinar, but gratitude is a great motivator. It helps people feel important and special, just as flattery does. Now, they're both different techniques, but with this, they level their first, thank you for your review. Appreciation is a wonderful way of showing gratitude, and you're the best. So flattery, a fake compliment. And then they have a couple of calls to action. So they're keeping this all positive and using a number of different techniques to make someone feel good and then make the request, as opposed to just making the request without that positive emotion. Now, let's look at a couple of pressure tactics in combination. So in the bottom left, the value proposition, the main motivator was actually on the prior screen, so you can't see that in this example. But what they use is they use a few pressure stress tactics. So saying this webinar starts in 13 minutes and 12 seconds, you know, they want it really to be a tight countdown. You only have 12 seconds. Anyone counting the seconds is normally using a pressure tactic. Then they have an optimistic message. Yes, reserve my seat. That's the main action. And a little bit of like a stressed, a bit of a pessimistic message. No thanks, I don't want more traffic. So that's that default option. I have strong opinions on those types of messages and how they're framed. I normally prefer when they're a bit more stress and pressure rather than something that's potentially degrading, because it has a different emotional valence and people constantly confound those two. So can I ask in the chat box, does anyone have any examples of web design or even specifically conversion strategies that cause you to feel degraded or insulted? And if you could add a couple into the chat box, that would be awesome. Anyone? Okay. Oh, sorry. I missed some of the screens. Okay, so content is offered for free, but then you find out a catch. I hate the ones that make you click on no, oh, I don't like saving money, not getting confirmation message in emails, booking.com, very high pressure website. Neil Patel does it a lot, but I know it works, not on me. 5 seats left. Okay, so we're all quite aware of many of these tactics. And so here's like that classic. So sign up to get our amazing ebook. Sure, I'm smart, or no thanks, I'm an idiot. Is sort of the emotional valence. So I personally, I don't have the statistics on these. My sense from doing this type of work is that they might work on some people, but they really do rub a number of people the wrong way. I do a lot of emotional design testing and find that people what happens with these is, yes, they do work with some people, but they trigger extreme hostility in others. So I think they have a bit of a polarizing impact. And possibly if people are targeting very specific segments that don't feel fully secure, then this might be an effective tactic. I do have personal ethical issues, and I don't like to do anything that's disrespectful. So I avoid these like the plague. Now, that negative message doesn't have to be degrading. It can be a pressure tactic, or it could be a respectful type of out, like, no thanks, not right now. So you know, there are other ways of doing it. And so just be a little careful on that. Now, here's like one example. Unsubscription successful. This is after I unsubscribed, and they throw a little happy face. Does anyone have any sense of whether this unhappy face at this point is contributing to anything? Some guilt. Nope, not for me. Makes me want to restore to a happy face. Yeah, kind of guilty a bit. Double negative, bottom left quadrant. Yeah, these can trigger some negative responses. Now, normally if you're going to have a negative emotion, you're going to want to do it before someone unsubscribes, because you might have a chance of getting them to change their mind. But you normally don't want to do this after the fact, because, you know, the emotion, it's sort of like leaving a little bit on negative terms. I'd rather leave with a respectful outro rather than, you know, a guilt trip. So you might have a pre-unsubscribe page saying, you know, are you sure? You know, we'll miss you, and if you prefer, you can just receive less emails from us. So a mitigation tactic is a better application of the negative. And then, you know, if someone unsubscribes saying, you know, it was great having you. If you come back, we'll look forward to seeing you. So, you know, leaving with a bit more of a, like a positive, respectful outro. It's a bit more of the emotional tone I prefer to work with it. So we have about 50 minutes left, so I'm going to introduce you to personality targeted design concepts. So just a little bit of, I want to talk briefly about the state of the art. So personality targeted web design, messaging, segmentation has been around for a long time. Scientists have been researching it for quite a while. We know that websites that match a person's emotional tone can be more effective. Websites that have a misguided personality, so like say an extroverted website and extroverted content, doesn't work as well with introverts. So people will resonate better with content that's tied to there as a person. Segmenting software is getting better and better, and I don't think it's going to be too far on till we're living in an age where Minority Report type advertising exists that reads people like a book. But we're still moving towards that. So let me talk a little bit about some of the science, and I'll talk about some of the practical examples and what you can do with basic tools. So there have been crazy advances in personality and neuroscience in the last few years, and understanding personality. So personality tools, for starters, are not anything new. So the ancient Greeks had them, and in fact, Aristotle has personality concepts that are not all that far off from some of the good scientific tools around today. Now, what often happens in industry is people jump on the bandwagon for things that are, you know, don't really have a lot of merit. So the system Myers-Briggs personality type, that comes from a mother and daughter duo who had actually no psychology background. They built personality tools based on Carl Jung, who's trying to rectify issues with Freud. So the most popular personality tool is actually derived from research that goes back, you know, like almost 100 years. So it's a little dated. It's time to update. So what modern scientists use is something called the Big Five. So you'll see for a lot of the scientifically based personality targeted tools, they are based largely on the Big Five. That's what psychiatrists or psychologists use. Tools are, they're reliable. They come apart. They almost emerge in multiple independent studies. Like, it's hard to even avoid the big five. They're just so finely ingrained, and these are very robust tools. Now, in the 80s, there was some work on trying to look at the biology of personality. So asking questions, well, shouldn't there be a biological basis for why a person is one way or another? And so there is a temperament inventory from the 80s, which is one of the popular biologically based tools in a small scientific niche. And then there's the work of Helen Fisher, who started looking at personality in love and developed biologically based personality tools. Now, me and my colleagues, we were inspired by Helen Fisher's work and some of the earlier studies on biological links to personality. And so we've spent the last 3 years rebuilding personality tools on the neurobiological basis. And so I'm going to introduce the tools that we use. But before we do that, one final thing is, let me put personality into perspective. So why does personality even matter for conversion, for web design, for having an impact on our target audiences? Well, personality is more the consistency in who a person is. So it gives a person's emotional and cognitive disposition. So by that, I mean how people generally respond emotionally to different situations and how they respond cognitively. So when it comes to cognitive biases and emotional preferences, by knowing a person's personality, you can get a sense of what sort of cognitive biases are going to be driving their decision-making, and what sort of like emotional dispositions are also going to drive their decision-making. So personality is core, and scientists believe that's about 50% based on genetics. Moods are these long-term affective states, and an emotion is what happens when we respond to an immediate situation. And that has the ability to hijack our mind, how we think, feel, and act. Let me introduce the tool that we work with. So we work on a small number of categories that we put together. Now, if you're reading through this, could you just take a moment, just look at the groups on the top between anchor and seeker, and just quickly look through and see, do I feel I'm more of an anchor on the left? I'm more traditional, risk avoiding, routine liking, and very sort of focused on tasks? Or am I more like a seeker? I'm not really traditional. I'm a risk taker. I don't like routine, and I'm a pretty high energy person. So if you feel you're more an anchor, give yourself an A, or if you're more of a seeker, give yourself an S. For the next, and then actually, if you want to at the end share your letters, go for that, and we'll just be we'll share it all together. So if you're more a feeler, you're going to feel a bit more emotional. You probably have a bit more of a creative drive. You'll have a lot more compassion and empathy towards other people. And you'll probably be very polite and emotionally sensitive to others. If you're more a thinker, you're probably going to be more analytical. You're going to be very decisive, fairly disciplined, and you'll be blunt. So you might accidentally insult people from time to time because you don't. You're just saying what you think, and you're not as worried about how people will interpret it. And now the next is reactive. So this is a measure of how quickly you react to a stressful situation. So if you're low reactive, it means you're a fairly chilled out person. You would call yourself calm, relaxed. You react slowly to situations. And when your emotions fire up, they're not as intense as other people. If you're highly reactive, you're probably going to feel a bit more stressed and anxious overall. When a threatening situation comes, you might be one of the first people to react, or you react much earlier than others, and you have a stronger emotional response. So you could give yourself an A or an S, an F or a T, and for the last one, you could give yourself a plus or a minus if you're like normally high or reactive. And I'm going to share mine right now. So now our tool was built on relationships between dopamine and serotonin, oxytocin, estrogen, testosterone, and a few other neurotransmitters related to the reactive score, like norepinephrine, and cortisol. But we have these simple terms that we use to describe them. So if you're a bit more of a seeker, you might also be a bit more of a feeler, or you might also be more of a thinker. If you're more anchored, probably a bit more traditional, and you might navigate the world more as a feeler or thinker. Some people do score like right in the middle. Most people will pull towards seeker or anchor, feeler or thinker, and have a range of reactive scores. Now, depending on where you are, you're going to have certain strengths and certain weaknesses for your creative ability to do content. So one of the keys in emotional design and targeting people by personality is starting off with your own biases and looking in at yourself and saying, well, you know what, if I'm really emotionally oriented and I'm very conservative, you know, am I the right person to do ad copy for like an adventure, like say an outing gear company? If I'm writing ad copy and like calls to action and value propositions for them, and they're as full of these like thinker seeker people, you know, am I gonna like be off base, and do I really know these people well enough? So there's no problem with that as long as you can put yourself in other people's shoes. So what's key is knowing your own limits, because you know the problem is when we write content to try and make a conversion, if we don't know our target audience well enough, we might be trying to convert ourselves. And that's where the measurement really comes in, because the measurement shows you when you're on or off the market and lets you experiment. The more we know our audience, personality to us, let us play with concepts that will help us go into the constellation. It also helps us with our colleagues, because I'll tell you where I am. I'm actually a fringe personality. I load extreme seeker and very strong thinker. So I'm like an adventure-taking analyst. I don't always write the best copy for very conservative, family-oriented people, and it's a weakness that I recognize. If I have a colleague who is of that personality type, of course they're who I'm going to go to. So you can also save time by seeking out people who you think you have a reasonable basis for believing that they're more similar to your target audience who you're trying to convert. And so seeking these people out and getting their take can be very valuable for the creative process. Now, what happens when you have a situation where, say, our audience segment 1, they're up there, they're very emotionally oriented, extreme emotive people. And target audience 3 on the other spectrum, they're extreme analysts. So these, you know, we could probably segment these groups. With the emotional side, we'll probably have a lot more pictures of people and stories in the content, and content that's going to resonate with people that type. Whereas at the bottom with the analysts, we're going to target them. You know, this is where you're going to pull out that flow chart and those analytical diagrams that turn off the other audiences. But what happens when a segment is divided into radically different personality types? So say audience segment 2 has very conservative and very adventurous risk-taking types of personalities. In that case, you might need to segment your messaging, or what you're going to have to do is you're going to have a landing page, and you're going to have to balance between a couple of different audiences. And you know, this is a reality for a lot of conversion design, is segmenting tools are just not there yet. Like we're not yet at the point where we can read people's neurochemicals and know exactly which category to put them in. I think it's coming, but we're not yet there. So that means you're going to have to appeal to both. You're going to have to write the same value propositions. And so normally what will happen is you will have less effective landing pages. Sometimes there's nothing you can do about it, because you're trying to balance between multiple groups, and they're different people. And you know, it is hard to segment. You know, a lot of segmenting tools are going to go with like browsers and locations, and yes, there are correlations, but they're small. So we have to get comfortable with these balancing acts. Now, I developed a tool called the Personality Test Zone, where we have been developing our tools. It's our publicly available interface. And this is what the map looks like. So you can compare yourself with other people. And this is Deborah, who I work with. Now, Deborah has a very different personality than me. And I hired Deborah because I thought she had strengths that I didn't have. One of my colleagues early on asked me, said, Brian, wouldn't you like to have more people like yourself in the company? And I said, are you kidding? Do you know how fast we would go bankrupt? So I want a diversity of people who can bring various perspectives to our work. And when it comes to the creative process, it's wonderful if in your office you can run things quickly by a number of people before you start doing your full testing. So it's going to save you time. So the more people with different perspectives, the better. So Deborah is very different from me. Like I said, I'm that risk-taking analyst, and Deborah is more emotional-oriented and conservative. But we're both mark high on our curiosity and seeking. We're not going to go into detail now because we're pretty much at the end, but we will also use this as a basis for creative brainstorming. So the more we can get a sense of our personality types, the better we'll be in a position for targeting people, for coming up with experiments on what type of content is most appropriate. So just in the future, I think it's only a matter of time, but we're going to have our digital footprints revealing so much about our core predisposition, who we are. And I think it's not going to be very long before most companies are going to have like a signal to like the personalities of the users on screen. Is this going to be like groundbreaking? I think it's going to change the game, but of course, once everyone else is in the game, we're still going to, at the end of the day, have to have good creative content and good ideas on how to engage people. And this will be a never-ending battle because, of course, we're going to be doing it, but so will all our competitors. And I think it's just going to change how we operate. So this is everything. So one thing I just wanted to share is Susie gave me a code to share with everyone. So Conversion XL offers digital psychology training, and Susie gave me 100% off code, which I'm going to share with everyone. And we are at the end, but if anyone wants to stay in touch, you can find me. I blog at AlterSpark, and also I use Twitter quite a lot, so I'm at Cugelman. And, oh, sorry, I'm not 100%. It's $100. Sorry, our dollar sign is a little bit backwards. So, dope, sorry, that's all right. And if anyone has any questions, we have just a couple of minutes, so go ahead, I'm here. Okay, so I was asked how I analyze data to determine personalities. So personally for myself, I do techniques that are not so readily available. So I work with linguistics and language detection. So me and my colleagues, we look at people's social media profiles, and from that we make predictions about how a personality falls based on their choice of language. And we also have been developing models based on digital footprints. When it comes to web signals, we're looking at a number of options for making better predictions, but we're rolling out at the end of a long R&D stage, and we're looking down multiple areas. So no one has really cracked this yet. So one of the easiest ways to target by personality is not so much on site, but more at the traffic level. So based on segmenting beforehand, going out to get people and then tagging them and monitoring them. I believe it will be possible to identify personality through how a person uses a website, and we are working on that. But these are tools we're just rolling out, and I haven't seen them on the market. Some companies, you know, they use every scrap of data they can get, like browser settings and where someone came from. It's easier in social media because you can classify personality based on collaborative filtering algorithms. So looking at the pages people like and what they do in common. That's probably one of the easiest ways. So in a website, the headline. Okay, so here's a question. So in a website, the headline is the best element to convince someone to convert. Well, the headline, if it's a value proposition, should be the motivator. Now, not all headlines are value propositions. Some are statement of facts. So they're more like telling you what the features are. And if the person knows that the features are of use to them, then it can motivate. Now, I generally use the headline as the best of all your different motivators. And then that is the thing that will motivate them to convert, but it won't necessarily convince them. So you will have to do some education to do the convincing, but the headline should do the motivating. Do I see a difference in personality type for Android versus iPhone users? I know there have been studies on personality type differences. I know there are certainly demographic differences. I think there are personality type differences associated with all sorts of products. I've come across ad hoc. I haven't studied, that myself in depth on like iPhone versus like Android, but I have heard of studies where this is a funny. iPhone users are allegedly a bit more loose and risk-taking than Android users was one study, but I haven't looked in depth on that difference. Okay, so testing. So with macro versus micro, how do you adjust for copy or site content when initially adjusting for personality? So one thing I'll typically do, and this is only in custom platforms that I build myself. So I don't do this. I've never done this for using like third-party plugins, but it's in my own databases when I can plug in and know something with confidence. So normally what I'll do is different levels of tailoring. So like conversion rate optimization for me is when you tailor for like a population segment and you don't know exactly who's on it. So you come up with your best average message. And that's sort of like level one. It works for most people who are on. And through the optimization process, you better understand it. The next is when you do targeting by groups. So I might know that this one group versus that group is different. So I might know that this group is going to be a little bit more into people, and the other group is going to be more into analytical information. And so these will be two big groups. And then I could go down to the next level of going to the person. So I could know that this individual person likes this type of thing and doesn't like that type of thing. Or what we're doing with our company now is going to the level of individual persuasion tactics. So with this person, use a loss aversion tactic. With that person, use an incentive. This person likes social norms. They're more likely to comply. That person's a rebel. Don't even try a social norm because it will turn them off. And so you go in the level of the population, then the groupings, and then to individualized. And it depends on how much data you can get your hands on. And at some point, I mean, like most of the tools don't even do this. They're expensive. And it's something you can only do when you own your platform. So it really is a big custom job. So. So what's the most efficient means of discovering personalities of existing prospective users? So for myself, we're developing tools to automatically do it, but what other people do is they literally give out questionnaires. So they either ask a segment to complete a personality tool, or they will go out and try and maybe do an ethnographic approach and try and do it like through, making reasonable estimates through interviews and going on and looking at your customers. So if you have a customer list and you have pretty neat segments, like one of the nice ethnographic methods is to randomly select different addresses. This is going to be easier in B2B, because B2C, it can be really hard to track people down, but B2B, it's fairly easy because a lot of people are just going to be on LinkedIn. Look at these people and start doing some qualitative analysis, breaking them up. It is several days of work and very insightful and can help you understand a lot more. And then, you know, every once in a while, you do have to do qualitative research to get to a deeper insight. So does less is more work for effective emotional targeting? Yeah, I think generally less is more. But I wouldn't shy away from details, especially with some audiences. So I think when there's a low level of risk and you can easily get people to, you know, sign up for something like, say, a lead gen page or opt into a newsletter, and there's not a big cost to them, you know, a quick motivating message and incentive is wonderful. If you want someone to buy a car, yeah, you're going to have a lot of technical details. Now, the emotional part is going to be the part that works on the motivation and building confidence and trust, and also possibly working with pressure tactics. But then you're going to need to satisfy the cognitive part. So that's with some of the educational content. So is it better to work with good color contrast, or color psychology can motivate someone to convert? No. Oh, sorry, just one second. My general philosophy of color, based on what I understand of the science, is there is no magic color that automatically conveys emotional meaning. So I primarily use color to attract people, to aid comprehension, for UX, to help people understand the next step. So I really use it a lot for guiding people through processes. At the same time, there are color associations based on a person's culture and what they've been brought up with. So not universal truths, but cultural associations. And so we can have certain connotations that go with color. I think they contribute. You know, normally with psychology, there's no one, like, you know, okay, there are techniques that are much more effective than others, but often they bank up together and we don't always know how they combine. I think color can really help a lot in terms of credibility and low levels of trust that sort of sit behind the other psychological tactics that you're going to use to try and get someone to convert. I don't think they'll ever do the heavy lifting. So I think at most they have like a contributing factor to credibility, trust, and confidence. Mainly they'll help with clarity in UX and clear processes. So have I tried Google surveys, and what do I think about the quality? I like Google surveys. They're wonderful. I mean, like, yeah, companies used to have to pay like $100,000 to do a national survey by the few companies that have monopolies, and now you can do one for like $100 with Google consumer surveys. So they're wonderful. Now, the weakness and the thing that I'm cautious of is you can't compare variables. So Google surveys, if you ask more than one question, of course the prices go up very high, but they're answered by different people, so that if you're trying to get insight into motivations, the problem is you can't really compare answer 1 and answer 2, so it's not really good for it's more like insight into emotions and motivations. What I find Google surveys are good for is demographic data, so understanding descriptions about a population, but you can't do too much with the data. So, I mean, for the money, holy crap. I thought they were game-changing when they were released. Okay, so not sure if this is a valid question. Is there a difference from targeting women versus men? I find women more emotionally evolved than men, majority of them. Any tips on marketing women versus men, for example, women cosmetics? I have, some strong opinions based on our research, and I'm going to draw on the same area of research that got this fellow fired from Google. So there is a lot of research on psychological differences between men and women. And we know that there is a big controversy on this in Google. How I was weighing in on that debate is that the person who was fired was actually drawing on legitimate areas of science, but the way he framed it was, I think, was a way that was, not gender equal. It was like unfair, but so, and the scientific community also kicked in around it, with some scientists saying that this person's research was bunk, and others were saying this is grounded science. And what my opinion was that the scientists who are looking at gender differences in terms of biology, so those with a more neuroscience or biological background, will say yes, men and women are radically different, and we have been measuring brain development and how they evolve differently. Those in psychology would say we don't see a difference. So based on the area of research that I've been in, there is actually quite a lot of overlap between men and women, but there's a slight tip towards more emotional, social orientation in women, and a bit more of a slight tip towards men in terms of systemizing and analytical. Now, when you actually look at the research, the overlap is fairly large. So that means there will be a lot of men who are fairly high on empathy scales, much more than a lot of women. So there are some trends or some generalizations. Obviously, you have to market test, but there's a lot of research, and I find that there are these differences, but test them, it will depend on the product. One of the big things is the research on oxytocin. So after giving birth, women, their oxytocin levels go up. So their social orientation will be higher as a difference from between versus after birth. And so oxytocin impacts on people's perception of pictures, faces, and reading emotion and empathy. So one of the differences between men and women will be different between those who have had children and those who have not, according to a lot of the research. Now, I have not done testing on this, but that's a huge amount of science that would support that. Okay, so question is, are you saying that details drive emotions? So normally the technical details are a bit part of the cognitive process, or they aid sort of cognitive comprehension and understanding. Technical details can impact emotions in terms of helping someone understand a situation, then evaluating if it's a good or bad situation. So they're going to help in that sense, in that the comprehensions, and I mentioned the schemas, so the cognitive understanding of the situation does impact on emotions because they impact on our interpretation of the situation. What do heat maps tell you about personality types? That is something I am working on, and in fact, I have my suspicions, and I don't know. So a friend of mine who has a doctorate in physics is going to help me deal with some heat map data, and we're looking for specific trends. So one thing I look at in heat maps for personality is stress and anxiety. And like, this is hypothesis, so don't quote me on this as anything definitive. I haven't yet reached my conclusion. So I'll just tell you where my thinking is on this subject, which to my knowledge, very few people have answers. I look for confidence and unconfidence. So people who are possibly feeling stressed and anxious and uncomfortable in the situation versus those who are feeling confident. And I look for assertive types of movements versus, like hesitation, sort of like a hesitant driver, someone who's like, they're sort of moving forward and they're pulling back, and you can see it in most movements. I have my suspicions. We have not empirically tested yet, but that's one thing I do look for in like mouse movements. Heat maps, I don't know as much, but maps of movement is I look for people who jump up and down a lot, where I feel that means people don't feel confident reading the content and they're jumping around. And when you get it right, you get a smooth scroll. How do we choose images to motivate users to convert? So you have to test images. So normally what I do before I even bother putting a single image on my page, I do market testing for the cheapest way possible. So I'm going to use ad platforms to test my images before I bring them on page, and then I have a sense of what works and what doesn't. Now, the problem is that a lot of ad platforms are very biased, so they have these burst algorithms, so the high performance ads go out faster. So if you don't know about those biases, you'll make really bad mistakes. Like Twitter is awful for trying to do like comparative testing. Like it just bursts early on. You don't know why it picked one ad over another. Maybe just a few people randomly clicked in the first 10 minutes, and so now your data is completely biased. So Google's pretty good for that. LinkedIn, it's a bit more pricey, but you could get very good multivariate picture tests. Google is not bad for it. And I have a hack I do in Facebook. So I know that Facebook doesn't burst its ads in one direction or another till each of them have had about 500 impressions. So I do it quick and dirty. It might not be enough for like a full-scale test, but it gives you pretty good indicators if you run it in different groups. So I'll run a bunch of images, same ad copy, see how they perform at 500 impressions each. I pull the plug, then run another test. So. Okay, so do I think there's sufficient information available in the public domain to reach for like professional levels of knowledge without going to academia? And if so, can you recommend some sources? So I'm obviously biased here because I was a professional for many years. I started off in my home city of Toronto running digital campaigns. I happened to have started early in 1997. And because, I was in a rising tide, pretty much everything I did was crazy successful. And I developed a lot of good advanced techniques with the years. So I always also stayed ahead of others. I've always had good information in the public domain, but what I learned in academia is that the academic models are often wonderful. They're fairly robust. The problem, academia is divided, and there's a lot of camps. People think the scientists have all the answers, and they don't. It's divided in there as much as any other area. There's academic silos and debates, but scientists at least will do big meta studies and big comprehensive reviews, and they have methods for resolving the big debates about what works. So you can go and work on these and really get a good sense of the consensus, and things are transparent. So I'm biased because I think the scientific community does have mechanisms for flushing out the nonsense and letting the successful things eventually reach the surface. Often this stuff doesn't translate to the public with people who do it. So I do this work, and I know a number of other colleagues, they do this. Now, private sector also has a lot of great resources. There is a lot of bunk nonsense claims and content coming from the self-help industry and things that people believe. I think there's like great companies. I love Conversion XL. Like I read their editorial guidelines. It's wonderful. It says no bullshit. Basically, they say at least have evidence behind everything you say, and so they impose standards that I think are wonderful, and they vet them. And Conversion XL, they encourage people to come out and at least provide a backing. And a lot of companies have this. I was speaking with Michael from Unbounce actually the last few days. I love their work at Unbounce. They data mine landing pages on a scale like no scientist will ever have access to. And so in the private sector, there are also a lot of companies that have great insight that no scientist will find. They will never get access to those data sets. And so Unbounce produces great advice. And I know they tour around all the time. They call the Action Conference, and they bring up really solid people. So those are a couple of sources I would recommend. Some books to keep studying. Well, if you like this subject on profiling, probably one of the best is from Meritus Caption on persuasive profiling. And I can share the book reference after. So his work is grounded in very high quality science. He writes in very plain language, very accessible. Obviously, B.J. Fogg is a person who did quite a lot for taking a lot of the science and making it easily accessible to the general public as content. He hasn't written as much in the last few years. He's got some wonderful online resources, and I understand he has a book in the pipeline that's like rock solid, grounded in the science. There are a couple of practitioner books. I don't know. I'm sometimes hesitant to recommend them because they don't always. There's a lot of books that cherry pick studies, and they're just not systematic enough. And you can say anything you like if you just want to pick independent studies. So those are a couple that I really like. Oh, and one of my favorite, who really has not gotten a lot of traction, and you'll have to do the work to translate his work over, and it might seem like old research, but if you're interested in emotions and personality in this subject, I can't say enough about actually B.J. Fogg's mentor, Clifford Nass, who spent 10 years looking at how people interact with computers similar to how they interact with other people. And he did a lot of our early studies on what we know about personality as relationship with the user and how systems evoke all sorts of emotions. In fact, I consider Clifford Nass probably one of the most important academics for understanding the unique areas of digital psychology and digital behavioral science. But for, I guess, market reasons, other approaches have come to dominate. And I think that in the years to come, his work is going to be the work that explains more of the unusual trends online than anything else. Now, apart from his work, a lot of the digital psychology is fairly straightforward. But he explains some of the strange things that I think we're going to soon have explained by neurobiology. And we are now 22 minutes over. So it's Clifford Nass. I will add these captions in just a moment. Sorry, I don't have access, but I can. Hold on, let me. Here, it's Nass, not Mass. So. And one of his popular books is called The Media Equation. So this is more straightforward science. And it's going to explain more of the principles behind the scenes. So it's not going to tell you how to apply this to a landing page, but it will change your perspective on how people interact with computers. And it's going to be a lot more, if you look at something like the work of Cialdini, there's a lot of people who teach digital psychology, and they mainly just summarize Cialdini's 6 principles and tell you, okay, look, you can apply Cialdini's work to a website. Clifford Nass will fundamentally change how you understand humans interact with technology. Okay, hold on here. Let me quickly pull up the my browser, and I'll get all those references out. So hold on 1 second. Okay, and I'll give the exact reference, so just one moment. Okay, so here's the link to Meritus's book. Actually, here. Okay, so this is the book called Persuasion Profiling, and here you have MAUR. Can you read it? Okay. MAURITS KAPTEIN. And then the other one I've already given like a link to. Thanks, everyone. Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure.